Have you ever been in a situation where people you trusted wanted nothing more than to see you destroyed in front of everyone who mattered? Where they orchestrated an entire scheme designed to humiliate you so thoroughly that you'd never recover? That's exactly what happened to me, and I'm still shaking when I think about how close they came to succeeding. But here's the thing nobody expected, least of all them. One single question from a judge who saw right through their performance turned their perfect plan into their worst nightmare. And what they intended as my public execution became the most satisfying moment of vindication I've ever experienced. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what matters is that I'm here to tell you about the day I walked into a courtroom expecting to lose everything and walked out watching the people who betrayed me face the consequences they so carefully planned for me. This isn't just a story about justice. It's about resilience, truth, and that moment when you realize that sometimes the universe really does balance the scales in ways you never imagined possible. I need to take you back to understand how I ended up in that courtroom, heart pounding, palms sweating, feeling like every eye in that room was a weapon pointed directly at my chest. For 3 years, I had worked at a mid-sized marketing firm in the city, pouring my heart and soul into building campaigns that actually mattered. I wasn't just clocking in and out. I was the person who stayed late, who volunteered for the difficult clients, who mentored the new employees even though it wasn't in my job description. I genuinely believed I was building something meaningful, that I was part of a team that valued hard work and integrity. How naive I was. How completely and utterly naive. The betrayal started so subtly that I didn't even recognize it was happening. It began with my supervisor, Marcus, a man I had considered not just a boss, but a friend. We'd grab coffee together, discuss strategy, even shared personal stories about our families. I trusted him completely. And my colleague Jennifer, who sat in the cubicle next to mine, who I'd helped land a major client presentation that boosted her career, I trusted her too. They were the architects of my downfall, and I had handed them every tool they needed without even realizing it. The first sign something was wrong came during a routine Monday morning meeting about 6 months before everything exploded. Marcus presented a campaign strategy that sounded eerily familiar, because it was mine. Word for word, concept for concept. It was the pitch I had emailed him 2 weeks earlier for his feedback. When I tried to speak up, to gently remind everyone that we had discussed this idea, he looked at me with this expression of confused concern, like I was having some kind of episode. "I appreciate your enthusiasm," he said in this patronizing tone that made my stomach drop. "But this strategy came from the executive team. I know you've been under a lot of stress lately, so maybe you're mixing things up." The room went silent. Colleagues who had worked with me for years suddenly found their notebooks fascinating. Nobody met my eyes. That's when I felt the first cold finger of fear trace down my spine, that primal instinct that something was very, very wrong. But I convinced myself I was being paranoid, that it was an honest misunderstanding, that Marcus would clear it up later. He never did. Instead, over the next several months, it kept happening. My ideas presented as someone else's, my work subtly undermined, my emails mysteriously getting lost in the system, meetings scheduled without me being notified. Then came the financial irregularities. Someone had been manipulating expense reports, inflating costs, creating fake vendor accounts, and funneling thousands of dollars out of the company. It was sophisticated, carefully planned, and when the company's audit team discovered it, every single trail led directly to my access codes, my approval signatures, my department. I remember the morning they called me into the conference room. It was a Tuesday, unseasonably cold for September, and I had just bought a new coffee from the shop downstairs, one of those overpriced lattes I allowed myself once a week as a small treat. I was actually smiling when I walked in, thinking maybe it was finally about that promotion I'd been working toward. Instead, I found Marcus, Jennifer, the head of HR, the company's legal counsel, and 2 people I didn't recognize but who I later learned were forensic accountants. The air in that room was so heavy I could barely breathe. "We need to discuss some serious concerns," the HR director said, sliding a folder across the table toward me. My hands trembled as I opened it. Pages and pages of documentation showing financial fraud, all apparently committed by me. Dates, amounts, signatures that looked like mine but that I had never written. "This is impossible," I whispered, my voice sounding small and distant even to my own ears. I didn't do any of this." Marcus leaned forward with this expression of deep sadness that I now know was completely fabricated. "I know this is difficult to face," he said softly, "but the evidence is overwhelming. We've tried to give you the benefit of the doubt, but we can't ignore what's right in front of us." That meeting ended with me being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. They escorted me from the building like a criminal, past colleagues who whispered and stared, past the lobby where I had entered so happily just an hour before, out into the cold September air where I stood on the sidewalk feeling like my entire world had just collapsed. I couldn't breathe properly. My chest felt tight. My vision blurred with tears I refused to shed in public. And I had this overwhelming sense of unreality, like I had slipped into some nightmare version of my life where nothing made sense anymore. I went home to my small apartment, sat on my couch in the dark, and tried to piece together what had just happened. How could this be real? How could anyone believe I was capable of stealing from the company I had dedicated 3 years of my life to? But as I sat there in the darkness, something shifted inside me. The initial shock began to harden into something else. Determination. I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I wasn't going to let whoever did this destroy me without at least trying to clear my name. The investigation that followed was a nightmare of bureaucratic procedures, legal jargon, and mounting evidence that seemed designed specifically to bury me. I hired a lawyer, a young attorney named Sarah Chen, who took my case even though I could barely afford her fees, paying her in installments from my rapidly dwindling savings. Sarah was brilliant, thorough, and most importantly, she believed me. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to frame you," she said during our first real strategy session, spreading documents across her desk like pieces of a puzzle. "This isn't amateur hour. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, had access to sensitive systems, and understood how to make it look convincing. But here's what they didn't count on. Nobody's perfect. There will be holes in their story, inconsistencies in the timeline, digital footprints they couldn't completely erase. We just have to find them." We spent weeks digging through every transaction, every email, every access log. I shared everything with Sarah. My concerns about Marcus taking credit for my work, the strange atmosphere at the office in the months leading up to the accusations, Jennifer's sudden coldness toward me after years of friendship. Sarah listened to everything, took meticulous notes, and slowly began to build a counter-narrative that made my blood run cold when I finally understood the full scope of what had been done to me. Marcus and Jennifer had been working together for months, possibly even years, embezzling money from the company through a sophisticated scheme of fake vendors and inflated expenses. But they knew eventually an audit would catch them, so they needed a scapegoat, someone trustworthy enough that their access wouldn't be questioned, someone dedicated enough that they'd have the passwords and authority to approve transactions, and someone isolated enough that when the accusations came, they'd have few allies to defend them. I had been perfect for their purposes. They had cultivated my trust, learned my routines, duplicated my digital signatures, and systematically positioned me to take the fall for their crimes. Jennifer had even befriended me specifically for this purpose, spending months learning personal details about my life, my habits, my vulnerabilities. Every coffee chat, every lunch conversation, every moment I thought we were building genuine friendship, she had been gathering intelligence to use against me. The realization was devastating. I had trouble sleeping, would wake up at 3 in the morning with my heart racing, replaying every interaction and wondering what else I had missed, what other signs I had been too trusting to see. My family tried to support me, but I could see the doubt in their eyes sometimes, that terrible question lurking beneath their encouraging words. What if there's some truth to this? What if we don't really know her as well as we thought? The company decided to press criminal charges, which meant this was going beyond just losing my job. I was facing potential jail time, a permanent criminal record, the complete destruction of any future career prospects. The prosecutor was convinced they had an airtight case. After all, they had my signatures, my access codes, my approval on dozens of fraudulent transactions. On paper, I looked absolutely guilty. Sarah worked around the clock, bringing in digital forensics experts, hiring investigators to track down the real vendors versus the fake ones, building a timeline that showed I couldn't have been in the office for several of the key transactions because I was verifiably somewhere else, at a conference, at a documented medical appointment, on approved vacation that HR had records of. But the prosecution had an answer for everything. I could have scheduled the transactions in advance. I could have had an accomplice. I could have accessed the systems remotely. Every piece of evidence Sarah found, they had a counter-argument ready. It felt hopeless. The trial date approached like an executioner's appointment, and I found myself cycling through every emotion imaginable: rage at the injustice, fear of what was coming, grief for the life I had lost, and underneath it all, a desperate hope that somehow someone would see the truth. Have you ever felt completely powerless? Like you're watching your own life fall apart and there's nothing you can do to stop it? That's where I was in the weeks before the trial. I stopped going out except for necessary meetings with Sarah. Friends stopped calling, some because they believed the accusations, others because they didn't know what to say, most because association with me had become socially radioactive. My apartment became my prison, my mind my torturer, replaying every moment and wondering how I could have been so blind. But Sarah never gave up. She kept digging, kept investigating, and about 2 weeks before the trial, she found something. It was a small thing, almost meaningless on its own, a pattern in the timestamps of the fraudulent transactions. They all occurred during a specific window of time each day, always between 2:15 and 2:45 in the afternoon. Sarah pulled my calendar for the entire 6-month period when the fraud occurred. During that exact time window, I was in a standing meeting with the creative team, a meeting that was mandatory, that I never missed, that had sign-in sheets and minutes and witnesses. There was no possible way I could have been making those transactions during those times. We had them. Finally, after months of feeling like I was drowning, we had something concrete, something undeniable. But Sarah's expression wasn't triumphant when she showed me. It was worried. "This is good," she said carefully. "But the prosecution will argue you had an accomplice, or you scheduled them in advance. We need more. We need to show who actually made these transactions, not just prove you couldn't have." The digital forensics expert Sarah hired was a quiet man named David who looked more like a college professor than someone who tracked cybercriminals. He spent 40 hours examining the company's server logs, the metadata from the fraudulent documents, the digital fingerprints that every computer action leaves behind. What he found was remarkable. Each of the fraudulent transactions had been initiated from 2 specific computer terminals in the office. One was Jennifer's workstation. The other was a shared computer in the accounting department that Marcus had regular access to. Even more damning, the person who created the fake vendor accounts had made several small mistakes, using variations of real vendor names with slightly different bank routing numbers, using addresses that didn't quite match, creating email addresses that were similar but not identical to legitimate companies. David traced the IP addresses used to set up those fake email accounts. They led back to Jennifer's home internet connection. We had them. We actually had them. But here's where it got truly sinister. When Sarah presented this evidence to the prosecution in a pre-trial meeting, hoping to get the charges dropped, the prosecutor barely blinked. "Interesting," she said, reviewing David's report with an expression that made my stomach drop. "But this doesn't prove your client didn't collaborate with these coworkers. In fact, it might suggest she was part of a conspiracy. We'll be adding additional charges for racketeering and criminal conspiracy." I nearly broke down right there in the prosecutor's office. They were going to use the evidence of Marcus and Jennifer's guilt as proof that I was involved too. It was diabolical, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep at all. I sat by my window watching the city lights, thinking about how quickly everything can change, how people you trust can become your worst enemies, how the truth sometimes isn't enough when lies are well constructed. I thought about calling my mother, but I couldn't bear to hear the worry in her voice again. I thought about what prison would be like, whether I'd survive it, whether I'd ever be able to rebuild my life afterward. I allowed myself to cry that night. Really cry. Not the angry tears I'd shed before, but these deep, soul-wrenching sobs that left me exhausted and empty. And then, when the sun started to rise over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I made a decision. Whatever happened in that courtroom, I was going to hold my head high. I was going to tell my truth clearly and calmly. I was going to trust that Sarah had prepared the best defense possible, and I was going to believe, despite everything, that justice might still be possible. I showered, put on the conservative blue suit Sarah had advised, tied my hair back neatly, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked tired, scared, but also determined. I was ready to face whatever came next. The courthouse was exactly as intimidating as I'd imagined. All marble and heavy doors and echoing footsteps that seemed to announce judgment with every step. Sarah met me at the entrance, her arms full of files and her expression carefully neutral. "Remember," she said as we walked through security, "stay calm, answer only what you're asked, and trust the process. We've prepared for this." But nothing could have prepared me for walking into that courtroom and seeing Marcus and Jennifer sitting with the prosecution team, looking perfectly composed, perfectly innocent, perfectly convinced they were going to watch me burn. Marcus was wearing an expensive suit I'd never seen before, probably bought with money he'd stolen while framing me for the theft. Jennifer had her hair styled professionally and wore an expression of sorrowful regret, like she was so disappointed in the friend who had betrayed everyone's trust. The performance was flawless. Several former colleagues were in the gallery, along with some reporters covering the case since it had garnered local media attention. Trusted employee embezzles thousands makes for a good headline. I felt their eyes on me, felt the weight of their judgment, and had to fight the urge to run. Sarah's hand on my elbow steadied me as we took our seats at the defense table. The bailiff called for everyone to rise, and Judge Catherine Morrison entered the courtroom. Judge Morrison was in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. I had done some research on her. She had a reputation for being strict but fair, unimpressed by theatrics, and known for asking unexpected questions that cut through witness testimonies like a knife. She reviewed the case documents for a moment, then looked up at the assembled courtroom with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This is quite an extensive case," she said, her voice carrying authority without being loud. "Before we proceed with opening statements, I want to make sure I understand the fundamental claims being made here." She looked directly at the prosecutor. "You're alleging that Ms. Sarah, working alone or in conspiracy with others, systematically defrauded her employer of approximately $78,000 over a 6-month period. Is that correct?" The prosecutor stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We have extensive documentation showing transactions approved under the defendant's credentials, signatures matching her known signature, and a pattern of fraudulent activity directly linked to her access privileges." Judge Morrison nodded slowly, then turned her attention to Marcus and Jennifer, who were listed as key witnesses for the prosecution. "And you two," she said, pointing at them with her pen, "were the defendant's supervisor and colleague during this time period. You worked closely with her, trusted her with significant responsibility, and were completely unaware of these alleged criminal activities happening under your direct observation for 6 months?" There was something in her tone, something sharp beneath the seemingly straightforward question. Marcus stood up smoothly. "Your Honor, it pains me to admit it, but yes. She was very good at hiding her activities. We had no idea until the audit revealed the discrepancies." Judge Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. "No idea at all? Despite being her direct supervisor? Despite supposedly reviewing her work regularly? Despite the rather significant amount of money involved?" She paused, then asked the question that would change everything. If she was so skilled at deception, so masterful at hiding these transactions, so careful in covering her tracks, then why did she leave such an obvious trail leading directly to herself? Why would someone intelligent enough to embezzle $78,000 be simultaneously stupid enough to use her own credentials, her own signatures, her own access codes without any attempt at misdirection? The courtroom went absolutely silent. It was such a simple question, so obvious in hindsight, but it cut directly to the fundamental flaw in the prosecution's case. Marcus's confident expression faltered. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The prosecutor started to respond, but Judge Morrison held up her hand. "That's a rhetorical question for now," she said, "but it's one I expect will be thoroughly addressed as we proceed. Because in my experience, criminals who are sophisticated enough to steal significant sums are usually smart enough to try covering their tracks. And criminals who are stupid enough to leave obvious evidence typically aren't sophisticated enough to embezzle $78,000 over 6 months without anyone noticing. It's a contradiction that troubles me." Sarah squeezed my hand under the table. This was it, the opening we needed. Judge Morrison had seen what we'd been trying to explain all along, that fundamental logical impossibility at the heart of their case against me. The prosecution's opening statement suddenly seemed less confident, more defensive, constantly circling back to the undeniable physical evidence, while glossing over the logical inconsistencies the judge had highlighted. When Sarah stood to give our opening statement, she was magnificent. She wove together the timeline, the digital forensics, the pattern of Marcus taking credit for my work, Jennifer's calculated friendship, the too-perfect setup that left every piece of evidence pointing to me and only me. She explained how the timestamps of the fraudulent transactions coincided exactly with mandatory meetings I attended, how the fake vendor emails traced back to Jennifer's home IP address, how the computer terminals used matched Marcus and Jennifer's exclusive access. And she kept coming back to Judge Morrison's question. Why would I be so careful in stealing yet so careless in leaving evidence? The answer was simple. I wasn't the one being careful. Someone else was being careful, and they wanted to make sure every trail led to me. When Marcus took the stand as the prosecution's first witness, he maintained that same sorrowful, disappointed demeanor. He testified about how much he had trusted me, how shocked he was to discover the betrayal, how the evidence left him no choice but to conclude I was responsible. He was smooth, practiced, convincing. The prosecutor walked him through each fraudulent transaction, and he confirmed that yes, those appeared to be my approvals, my signatures, my access codes. When Sarah stood up for cross-examination, you could feel the tension in the room spike. She started gently, asking about my work performance, my dedication to the company, my willingness to take on extra responsibilities. Marcus agreed to all of it. I was an excellent employee, always reliable, always trustworthy. So trustworthy that you gave her access to financial systems? Sarah asked. Yes, Marcus confirmed. That was standard for someone at her level. And your access codes, where did you keep those? Sarah asked casually. Marcus blinked, suddenly wary. What do you mean? Your personal access codes for the financial system. Where did you keep them? Written down somewhere? Saved in your computer? Marcus shifted in his seat. I kept them secure, as required by company policy. In a password manager? Sarah pressed. On a sticky note on your desk, in a file on your computer? I don't recall the specific method, Marcus said, his smooth confidence beginning to crack. But it was secure. Sarah pulled out a document. This is a photograph taken by the company's security audit in March of last year, before any allegations of fraud were made. It shows your desk, Mr. Marcus. And unless I'm mistaken, that yellow sticky note attached to your monitor has a series of numbers and letters on it. Would those happen to be your access codes? The prosecutor objected, claiming the photograph wasn't properly authenticated, but Judge Morrison allowed it, reminding everyone that security audits were standard company procedure and the photographs were part of official records. Marcus's face had gone slightly pale. Anyone could have seen those codes, Sarah continued. Anyone working in that office, including Ms. Jennifer, who sat approximately 15 feet from your desk, correct? I suppose, Marcus admitted reluctantly. And yet when the fraud was discovered, you immediately assumed my client was responsible rather than considering that someone might have used your poorly secured credentials? Sarah's voice was sharp now, cutting. Did it never occur to you that having your access codes visible to anyone who walked past your desk might represent a security vulnerability? Marcus stammered through a response about how he'd updated his passwords regularly, but the damage was done. The image of him as the careful, betrayed supervisor had cracked, replaced by someone careless with security who might have made it easy for the real thieves to operate. Jennifer's testimony was even more revealing. She played the hurt friend beautifully, talking about all the times we'd spent together, how much she'd trusted me, how devastating it was to learn about the betrayal. But when Sarah cross-examined her, focusing on those friendly coffee chats and lunch conversations, asking Jennifer to recall specific details about things I'd supposedly told her, inconsistencies started appearing. Sarah had done her homework, pulling my actual schedule, my credit card receipts, my text messages to other friends. Several of the lunch conversations Jennifer described never happened because I was provably somewhere else. Some of the personal details she claimed I'd shared were actually things I'd never told anyone. She was creating a narrative of closeness that hadn't existed, padding her testimony with invented intimacy to make her betrayal seem more profound. You say you and my client were close friends, Sarah said. Yet you can't accurately recall basic facts about her life, and you've described multiple conversations that never occurred. Why would you fabricate this closeness? Jennifer's polished composure cracked. I'm not fabricating anything. Maybe I'm just confused about specific dates, but we were friends. Or maybe, Sarah suggested quietly, you weren't actually friends at all. Maybe your entire relationship with my client was constructed for another purpose entirely. The prosecution tried to recover during their redirect, but Judge Morrison was paying very close attention now, making notes, asking occasional clarifying questions that kept pulling at the loose threads in their testimony. When David, our digital forensics expert, took the stand, he methodically destroyed the prosecution's technical case. He showed how the metadata from the fraudulent documents didn't match my computer's digital signature, how the timestamps proved I couldn't have been at the terminals when the transactions occurred, how the IP addresses for setting up the fake vendor accounts traced back to Jennifer's home network. The prosecutor tried to argue that I could have used Jennifer's computer or network, but David calmly explained that would require me to physically be at Jennifer's house using her personal computer, at times when my phone's GPS data showed me completely across town. Unless I had somehow developed the ability to be in two places at once, I couldn't have made those transactions. The evidence was overwhelming, but I could still see doubt in some of the jurors' faces. This was exactly what Sarah had warned me about. The truth can be complicated, requiring technical explanations and careful analysis, while lies can be simple and emotionally compelling. A betrayed supervisor and hurt friend made for a more straightforward narrative than digital fingerprints and metadata analysis. Then came the moment that changed everything, the moment I'll never forget as long as I live. Judge Morrison called a brief recess, and when we reconvened, she had a stack of additional documents in front of her. I've been reviewing the full audit report, she announced, not just the excerpts provided by the prosecution, but the complete document prepared by the company's forensic accountants. And I have some questions. She looked directly at Marcus and Jennifer, who were sitting in the gallery now that their testimonies were complete. The audit report notes that the fraudulent activity began approximately 7 months before it was discovered. But it also notes that there were 3 previous audits in the 2 years before that, and all of them found the financial systems to be completely clean. No irregularities, no concerns, no missing money. She paused, letting that sink in. So we're expected to believe that my client, who had been working at this company for 3 years with a spotless record and had access to these systems for that entire time, suddenly decided to start stealing money. Not gradually, not building up to it, but going from 0 criminal activity to $78,000 over just 6 months. Does that strike anyone else as an unusual pattern? The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, we're prepared to demonstrate that the defendant had financial pressures that motivated... Judge Morrison cut her off. I've reviewed the financial disclosure documents. The defendant had student loans, like millions of Americans, but was making regular payments. She had no gambling debts, no drug problems, no obvious financial crisis. Her bank statements show she was living within her means. So again, what suddenly changed 7 months before the discovery to transform a responsible employee into a prolific embezzler? The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah caught my eye and gave me the smallest nod. We'd provided all this information in our filings, but having the judge raise it herself in front of the jury, with that tone of skepticism, it was more powerful than anything we could have said. Judge Morrison wasn't done. Furthermore, she continued, I'm troubled by the timeline of events. According to the testimony, Mr. Marcus, you first suspected something was wrong approximately 3 weeks before the formal audit was initiated. You've testified that certain expense reports seemed unusual, prompting you to request the audit. Is that correct? Marcus stood reluctantly. Yes, Your Honor, that's correct. And yet, Judge Morrison said, pulling out another document, the audit request was submitted not by you, but by someone in upper management who had received an anonymous tip about financial irregularities. The tip specifically mentioned fake vendors and inflated expenses. It also specifically suggested investigating my client. This anonymous tip prompted the audit that discovered the fraud that you claim to have suspected independently. Quite a coincidence, don't you think? Marcus's face had gone from pale to almost gray. I may have mentioned my concerns to upper management before the formal request. But you didn't mention that in your testimony, did you? Judge Morrison's voice was steel now. You created the impression that you nobly came forward with your suspicions, when in fact, someone else, someone anonymous, initiated this entire investigation and pointed directly at the defendant. Who do you suppose sent that anonymous tip, Mr. Marcus? The courtroom was absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes, just staring at the scene unfolding. Marcus stammered something about not knowing, about company procedures, but his composure had completely shattered. Judge Morrison turned to Jennifer. Ms. Jennifer, do you know anything about an anonymous tip sent to upper management? Jennifer shook her head vigorously, but her hands were trembling. This seems like a rather elaborate frame-up, Judge Morrison said, looking at the jury now. Someone commits fraud, carefully uses someone else's credentials to do it, then sends an anonymous tip to make sure the investigation focuses on the fall guy. That level of premeditation suggests sophisticated criminal thinking. It also suggests that when this investigation began, someone already knew exactly what the auditors would find, because they had carefully prepared the evidence trail. She looked at the prosecutor. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer. Do you have any evidence placing my client at the computer terminals during the times these fraudulent transactions occurred? Do you have any evidence of her accessing these fake vendor accounts? Do you have anything beyond the circumstantial presence of her credentials? Credentials that, as we've established, were poorly secured and could have been accessed by multiple people in that office? The prosecutor stood, visibly frustrated. Your Honor, the signatures can be forged, Judge Morrison interrupted. The access codes can be stolen. The credentials can be misused. What I'm asking for is direct evidence. Video surveillance, keystroke logs, eyewitness testimony, anything that places her physically committing these crimes. The prosecutor had nothing. After a long moment, she admitted it. We don't have direct evidence of the defendant performing the transactions, Your Honor, but the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Circumstantial evidence that my client's lawyers have systematically challenged and raised reasonable doubt about, Judge Morrison countered. Circumstantial evidence that suggests the defendant was set up rather than guilty. I'm looking at a case built entirely on the appearance of guilt, carefully constructed by people who had means, motive, and opportunity to commit these crimes themselves. She stood up, and everyone in the courtroom rose with her. I'm calling a recess for the rest of the day. The prosecution will use this time to provide me with any direct evidence they may have failed to include in their initial case. If no such evidence exists, we will reconvene tomorrow morning, and I will give the jury instructions that reflect the substantial reasonable doubt that has been established. As Judge Morrison left the courtroom, I finally allowed myself to breathe. Really breathe, for what felt like the first time in months. Sarah grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight, her professional composure cracking just enough to show a huge smile. "She sees it," Sarah whispered. "She sees exactly what they did to you." Behind us, I heard Marcus and Jennifer arguing in hushed, frantic whispers. The reporters were already rushing out to file their stories, and I just sat there, feeling like the massive weight that had been crushing my chest for months was finally beginning to lift. That night, I actually slept. Not well, not peacefully, but I slept, which was more than I'd managed in months. When we reconvened the next morning, the atmosphere in the courtroom was completely different. The prosecution looked defeated before we even started. Judge Morrison took her seat and addressed the court. "The prosecution has informed me they have no additional direct evidence to present. Therefore, we will proceed to closing arguments." The prosecutor's closing argument was half-hearted at best, just going through the motions, emphasizing the credentials and signatures without the conviction she'd shown at the start of the trial. When Sarah stood to give our closing argument, she was powerful and precise. She walked the jury through everything: the impossible timeline, the digital evidence pointing to Marcus and Jennifer, the anonymous tip that conveniently started the investigation, Judge Morrison's observation about sophisticated criminals not leaving such obvious trails. She painted a picture of two people who had spent months carefully planning to steal from their employer and frame an innocent coworker, who had cultivated relationships and access specifically to set up their scapegoat. "The prosecution wants you to believe that my client suddenly became a criminal mastermind who was simultaneously careless enough to leave evidence everywhere," Sarah told the jury. "But the truth is simpler and more sinister. She was never the criminal. She was always the victim. And the real criminals are sitting in this courtroom, having committed not just theft, but the additional crime of trying to destroy an innocent woman's life to save themselves." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they came back, the four women stood and delivered the verdict I had been praying for, but barely dared to hope for: not guilty on all counts. The relief was so overwhelming, I actually felt dizzy. Sarah hugged me tightly while I cried, finally crying tears of joy instead of fear and frustration. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. She addressed the courtroom one more time, her voice stern. "Based on the evidence presented in this trial, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation into potential criminal charges against Marcus Reynolds and Jennifer Chang for theft, fraud, perjury, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I am also recommending that the original company audit be reopened with focus on these individuals." She looked directly at Marcus and Jennifer, who had gone absolutely white. "You will not leave this courthouse today without speaking to investigators. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Reynolds and Ms. Chang to the custody of the district attorney's office." Watching them being led away, the same route they had expected to see me take, was surreal. Marcus looked back once, and I saw in his eyes the moment he realized what his arrogance and greed had cost him. Jennifer was crying, her perfect composure completely destroyed, and I felt, not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of balance being restored. They had tried to ruin my life to protect themselves, and now they would face the consequences they had worked so hard to avoid. The aftermath of the trial was both wonderful and difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. The company offered me my job back with back pay and an official apology, but I couldn't imagine ever working there again. How could I trust any of those people who had so quickly believed the worst of me, who had watched me being escorted out and whispered about me, who had been so ready to see me as a criminal? I declined their offer but accepted a substantial settlement to avoid a wrongful termination lawsuit. The local media covered the reversal extensively. "Innocent employee freed after colleague's fraud exposed," made for an even better headline than my original conviction story. Some former colleagues reached out to apologize, to explain they never really believed it, but I could hear the hollowness in their words. They had believed it, or they'd been too cowardly to speak up, and either way, I had learned who they really were. The few who had genuinely stood by me, who had reached out during my darkest days despite the social cost, those relationships survived and even strengthened. You learn who truly matters when everything falls apart. I started therapy to process the trauma of what I'd been through. My therapist helped me understand that betrayal of this magnitude creates wounds that don't heal quickly, that it was normal to have trust issues, to feel paranoid sometimes, to wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing. She helped me separate the specific people who betrayed me from humanity in general, to not let Marcus and Jennifer's actions poison my ability to connect with others. Marcus and Jennifer both faced criminal charges. Marcus eventually pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud, receiving a 5-year prison sentence with the possibility of parole after 3 years. Jennifer fought the charges initially, but the evidence was overwhelming. The IP addresses, the digital forensics, the timeline that proved she'd had access when she claimed to be unaware. She eventually accepted a plea deal, serving 2 years and being required to make restitution. Their careers, their reputations, their freedom, everything they had tried to preserve by framing me was lost anyway. The universe has a way of balancing the scales, and sometimes it's even more thorough than you'd expect. I've thought a lot about why they chose me specifically. Was it just convenience? Or was there something about my trustworthiness, my dedication, my naivety that made me the perfect victim? I'll probably never know for sure, but I've made peace with the fact that their choice said everything about them and nothing about me. I didn't deserve what they did. No one deserves to be betrayed like that, to have their life weaponized against them, to be systematically destroyed by people they trusted. But it happened, and I survived it, and that survival has changed me in ways both difficult and profound. I eventually found a new job at a smaller marketing firm, one where the culture felt genuinely collaborative rather than competitive, in that toxic way my old company had been. I was nervous at first, hypervigilant about protecting my access codes, wary of forming close relationships with colleagues, but gradually I began to relax. My new boss, an older woman named Patricia, who had built the company from nothing, took me under her wing. When I finally told her what had happened at my previous job, she just nodded thoughtfully and said, "Betrayal like that either breaks you or forges you into something stronger. You seem like the forging type." She was right. I am stronger now, but it's a strength that came at a tremendous cost. I'm more careful about who I trust, more protective of my boundaries, more aware that people aren't always what they seem. But I'm also more confident in my ability to survive difficulty, more certain of my own integrity, more willing to fight for truth even when it's hard. The experience stripped away a lot of naivety, but it didn't make me cynical. I still believe most people are decent. I still think kindness matters. I just have better boundaries now and a much more accurate bullshit detector. Looking back on that moment in the courtroom when Judge Morrison asked her pivotal question, I'm still amazed by how one person's insight changed everything. She saw what others had missed, that fundamental logical flaw in the prosecution's case, that question of why someone smart enough to steal would be dumb enough to leave such obvious evidence. Sometimes justice comes down to one person being willing to think critically, to ask the uncomfortable questions, to see past the surface story to the truth beneath. Judge Morrison didn't just save my future that day. She validated my belief that truth matters, that facts matter, that careful thinking can overcome even sophisticated lies. I wrote her a letter after the trial, trying to express my gratitude, though I'm not sure any words could really capture what her intervention meant to me. She wrote back a brief note saying she was just doing her job, that every defendant deserves a fair examination of the evidence. But I treasure that note because it came from someone who genuinely embodied justice in action. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about what happened to someone you've never met, for investing your time and emotional energy in this journey with me. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you ever been betrayed by people you trusted, or watched someone else experience that kind of systematic destruction? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes just knowing we're not alone in these experiences helps more than anything else. This story isn't just about one person's legal battle, it's about something universal. It's about how easily reputations can be destroyed, how quickly people believe the worst, how hard it is to prove innocence once you've been accused. It's about resilience and the importance of finding people who believe in you when everyone else has turned away. It's about justice, not in some abstract legal sense, but in that visceral, deeply personal way where seeing your accusers face consequences finally allows you to breathe again. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about justice or betrayal or resilience, please leave a like on this video. It helps more people find these stories, and it lets me know that sharing these difficult experiences matters to you. And if you want to hear more true stories like this, stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges and finding the strength to survive and even thrive, please subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales And hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Every week, we share stories of resilience, justice, betrayal, redemption, and the incredible strength people find when they're pushed to their limits. These aren't Hollywood fantasies. These are real experiences from real people, told in their own words, and every story has something to teach us about human nature, about ourselves, about the world we live in. The comments section is a community here, a place where people share their own experiences and support each other through difficult times. Don't be a silent observer. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, connect with others who understand what it's like to face seemingly impossible challenges. Your story matters too, and you never know who might need to hear it, who might find hope in knowing they're not alone in their struggles. Thank you again for being here, for listening, for caring about truth and justice and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Until next time, remember that no matter how dark things seem, truth has a way of emerging, justice has a way of finding balance, and you are stronger than you think. Stay strong, stay true to yourself, and I'll see you in the next story.